This is our first session in a series that I have called So You Want to Present at a Tolkien Conference. And this is specifically on writing the proposal. And again, it's sort of geared to the fact that Meredith Adairthad proposals are due on January the 15th. So this gives us a couple of weeks to do that and to get those in. But it's really, like I've said in the communications so far, it's not in any way obligating anyone to put in a proposal for Meredith Adairthad, attend Meredith Adairthad. There are tons of other Tolkien conference opportunities coming up. Tolkien at UVM is another one that's coming up this spring. It's hybrid and very friendly. So it's really just a general sort of like, maybe I'm interested in doing this. Maybe this is a thing I want to do. So we thought holding some informational sessions to kind of demystify a little bit would be beneficial for people that are maybe considering it, but have never really taken the leap to actually write a proposal or submit a proposal in a lot of cases, because if you're not in academia or specifically in the humanities in academia, it can feel really intimidating. So that was kind of the background as to why we decided to do these sessions. And we'll have at least one more coming up, possibly two, depending on how ambitious I end up feeling at the end of the day. Okay, so just some encouragement. And I know I've talked a little bit about this now just in sort of getting ready, but this is absolutely something that many, many, many people in Tolkien fandom can do. So Tolkien studies is a really friendly field to both new and independent scholars. Independent scholars are people who are not affiliated with a university or academic institution. So I'm an independent scholar. I am affiliated with an academic institution in that I teach at a middle school, but it's not a university, so I'm not publishing as part of my job. So Tolkien Studies is super friendly to folks like me. I've presented at this point at probably like at least 24 conferences and have always felt just as welcome and equal. I've shared the stage on panels with people who are Ivy League professors, and I have felt just as welcome and wanted as they do. So it's very friendly to us. It's open to a lot of approaches, so that provides a lot of ways in for people to do what they already know. So if you're in the sciences, for example, then, you know, um, you can apply that to Tolkien. If you are in, the humanities, of course, that applies pretty readily, and so on. Part of the reason that this field, that Tolkien studies, is so friendly is because it's fun for pretty much everyone that does it. This is not a field where there are professional scholars. As a general rule, there are a few exceptions to that. So there are some exceptions to that. There are people who do make their living publishing about Tolkien, but they're very few and far between. So it's not like a field like Shakespeare studies, for example, where you have people that is what they're hired for at their institution, and that's how they make their living, is writing about Shakespeare. There are very few people who are professors at universities that are making their living doing research on Tolkien. So for them, a lot of times they're doing other fields, and Tolkien studies is kind of like a fun side hustle for them. And so when they go to conferences, it's not competitive, it's not it's they're there for fun, just like fans are. And it makes the setting a very friendly and welcoming and warm place as a general rule. And finally, there are many, many fans who have sidestepped from fandom to scholarship, which you just have to trust me on, because being in both worlds, a lot of times I know people who are like SWG members, for example, and also present regularly at conferences, but their fandom and their real life identities are not necessarily linked. And so it's not something that I'm at liberty of being like, oh, this person is presenting. They're one of our SWG members, really excited for their presentation. But there are many, many people who have made that sidestep, that are doing the kind of work that we're doing as fans. And at some point said, hey, I think I want to present this at a conference, or I want to publish my work even, and are doing that now. There's a lot of us doing that. So this is absolutely something that can be done, that is done, and is very attainable for someone who wants to do it. So that's the encouragement going in. Okay, so just really quickly, the purpose of a conference, if I know some people here have been to many of them, and maybe others have never been. So it's not to get up and present this final polished, brilliant piece of scholarship. it's in a lot of cases it's your work in progress and you're testing it out on a new audience. So it's an opportunity to test out something, get feedback, and see what people think about it, and make connections with others who are maybe doing work that you find interesting or are interested in your work. So it takes some of the pressure off of feeling like you need to have something absolutely finished and perfect. So a lot of times I will continue to work on it across years and then maybe publish it somewhere. And a lot of times it's still in progress. I'm still working on it. So some other just really quick basics. So format is something to keep in mind. So post COVID, of course, conferences come in a lot of formats. We have in-person, face-to-face, or F2F, as it's sometimes called. If you see that, that's what that means. Then you have those that are completely remote or virtual or online. And then you have those that are hybrid, which are a mix of the two. And my caution there is that if you are doing a hybrid conference, then make sure you're checking to make sure that the part that you want to do is hybrid. I'm thinking specifically of some of the larger conferences where they'll have a specific session that will have virtual options, but that other sessions are in person. So it's always just read the fine print and make sure you're signing up for what you actually want. But the vast majority of small Tolkien conferences, if they're advertising, like Tolkien at UVM is a prime example, or Meritha Derthad, if they're advertising that they're hybrid, then they are fully hybrid. So you can present in either format that you want, regardless of what you want to present on. And some conferences will have a theme. For example, UVM's upcoming conference is Tolkien and War, and the Mythopoeic Society's upcoming conference is Perilous and Fair, about women in Tolkien. So a lot of times you'll see an overarching theme for the whole conference. Not all conferences have themes, but most of the time there'll be an overarching theme. Some of the bigger conferences will sometimes have themed sessions. These are things like Popular Culture Association or the Kalamazoo Medieval Congress, and in which cases there'll be like sessions that you actually specifically apply for within their Tolkien studies area that are themed. And other conferences will group similar papers together after acceptance. So there's a lot of different approaches here. They also vary, of course, as far as whether or not, because nothing can be simple and straightforward and always the same. That would be too easy. But they vary as well as about whether or not they accept off-theme proposals. I will say that most conferences I'm familiar with do accept off-theme proposals. So if you're looking at something that's accessible to you, maybe it's local, or it's just one that you know is kind of at your level, where it's like maybe smaller or a little more friendly feeling than something that's bigger, then it never hurts to ask or to turn something in. Definitely you can always email the organizer and ask if they would accept an off-theme proposal, but you can also just kind of ask around to other people that have attended or presented at those conferences before. So last thing on conference basics is cost. So definitely check into this before you commit to something, because their cost can vary quite a lot. So smaller ones like Tolkien at UVM, I think was like $30 last year, with sliding scale for students and other people who are in part-time work. But then if you go to some of the larger conferences, I'm thinking Popular Culture Association, Kalamazoo, those can get to be very expensive, into a couple of $100s. And then, of course, once you're layering on potentially, if you're going in person, potentially traveling, then those expenses compound in there as well. But even if you're doing a virtual presentation, you still have to pay for the conference. And so I have definitely done conferences where it's like Oxenmoot was a perfect example. When I presented there, it was the first week back to school for me. And so I did not have the opportunity to attend a lot of sessions because I was at work while they were going on, or I was preparing for the students to return over the weekend. And so I paid for a conference just basically to present. And so just keep that in mind when you're looking at cost. Okay, so a couple of notes on presentation types. I remember furiously Googling this the first time I presented at a conference, because I was like, what do all these words mean? And they also mean different things in different fields. So the folks that I worked with to put this presentation together came from a variety of different fields. And it was interesting to hear how different experiences in different fields with some of these terms, how they differed. So Just know that if you're like in the STEM field, for example, then some of these words may be used differently. But this is as a general rule, when I see stuff I've seen all these are the how I see the terms being used for like Tolkien studies. So a paper session is your most basic one. You're a solo presenter, you're presenting your work, you have a set time to do it in. So that's the super simple, basic, easy one to kind of wrap your brain around. Sometimes you'll see advertised a panel. And this is where you have two or more people that are presenting on related topics. Now, really important to realize for a panel in Tolkien studies is that this is not collaborative. So if you send in a proposal and then you get usually you'll get the draft program at some point prior to the program being published, just to make sure times work for everyone. And you see that you've been put on a panel. That does not mean like, oh my goodness, now I need to suddenly collaborate with these two strangers. Nope. The organizer has just taken papers and said, well, it seems like these three papers are kind of about something similar, or use a similar approach. So I'm going to put them together in the same time slot. And usually panelists will share a question and answer, a Q&A at the end. So that's part of why they're organized that way. But it's not collaborative, and you don't have to do anything different than you would for a paper session, except that you will probably share your Q&A with other people. Some conferences, especially bigger ones, will allow multiple people to propose a panel. They'll even put out a call for panel proposals. So if you have other people, one or two or three other people that are doing similar topics to you and you want to propose a panel, then that's certainly an option as well. But that's less common than just kind of getting stuck on one kind of after the fact. And then finally, are roundtables and workshops, which are far less common in Tolkien studies and tend to be more at like the larger conferences, things like Popular Culture Association. And these are where it's really more about audience participation. So you have multiple people, again, who are presenting, but their sessions are super brief, or their presentations are super brief, like 5-10 minutes. And then most of the time is given over to discussion and Q&A with the audience. Expectations for collaboration on these vary quite a lot. Sometimes you and your fellow roundtable members will collaborate around it. Other times you've just been put together again because you have similar expertise, and so you've been asked to do your little 5-minute talk and then participate in the Q&A. So it varies, but you will never accidentally find yourself on a roundtable. So I've only ever seen it as, hey, this is a roundtable. If you're interested in being a part of it, let me know, or being invited to be a part of a roundtable, and based on expertise in that particular topic. Workshops, which I've never seen in Tolkien studies specifically, but do exist in the broader humanities, involve even more audience participation with activities and other things like that. So if you see that, that's what that means. Okay, so now what a paper session or a panel actually looks like, since most likely, if you're submitting a proposal for a conference, that's what you're going to be doing. Because like I said, you won't accidentally end up on a roundtable. So you'll have a set time to present. I recommend writing your paper with that time in mind. So I usually like divide mine into sections, like 3 or 4 sections, and it'll be like 5 minutes a section that I know that I have. And that way I stay within my time. It's really important to stay within your time. And this session is not about presenting. We'll be doing that one later. But, those of us that work on that will give some tips as far as staying within your time. But especially when you share a Q&A with other presenters, usually if you run over your time, then you're taking up, that comes out of the Q&A, which sucks for the other people that are also losing their Q&A time. So kind of having that time in the back of your mind, like I have 15 minutes to present, and writing the paper with that in mind. So you don't end up with an 8,000 page paper that you're trying to cram into 15 minutes. Your session will have a moderator. So the moderator does sort of all the work aside from presenting. So this is the person that will introduce you. Sometimes they will reach out ahead of time and say, hey, can you send me a biography or a couple of words to say, or tell me something about your work? Not always, but occasionally they will. And it's always cool to reply timely to them because they're there to help you and make life easy for you. And they will also handle the Q&A. So they'll be the person who will be calling on audience members. Good moderators, which is most in my experience, will make sure that all of the presenters get at least one question during the Q&A, even if they are asking those questions themselves. So they're really going to do the work to make sure that your experience is good. And then finally, at the end, will be the Q&A, which is usually a set block of time. And so you'll know you'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. If you're on a panel, you will probably share that with the other presenters. And if you're in an individual session, you may have your own individual Q&A, which is always fun. And the moderator, like I said before, is the person who handles calling on people. So stuff like that, that's sort of like off the cuff thing can be what feels the most nerve-wracking. A lot of people can get up and read a paper and do a presentation, but then managing the audience, for example, can feel really stressful. So just know going in that that is not an expectation of any conference that I've ever presented at. It's always handled by a moderator. Okay, so now why we're here, actually writing the proposal. So Janeway has contributed a really fabulous handout. She is a professor in the humanities and writing specifically. So her handout is here, will also be available at the end because I posted all of this on the SWG. I just need to unpublish, or I need to publish it when the session is over so that we all have access to it. So if you want her handout though, in the meantime to follow along, the QR code is on the screen and it should pop up. So paper proposals are really organized into 3 paragraphs. So your first paragraph is your introduction. Your middle paragraph is generally sort of the meat in the sandwich, so to speak, and that's your what and your how, which I'll get into, and I'll get into this more as we'll go through each one. And I have one of my own proposals that I've broken down to show where the different parts are as an example. And then your final paragraph is your conclusion or your so what paragraph. So before you get started, though, first of all, know how many words. So I cannot emphasize enough, and I feel very much like the middle school teacher that I am here and saying, read the directions. So know how many words your proposal can be. They're usually very short. I don't generally see them over 400 words. Some are much shorter than that, like UVM this year is only 200. So you don't have a lot of space to work in. But just keep in mind that everybody is working in the same constraints that you are. So it forces you to really have to distill down to like the core ideas of your presentation, which can be tough. It's the hardest part for me as somebody who tends to be a little wordy. So just keeping that in mind again, so that you don't end up with a proposal that's 900 words, and then when you go to paste it into the submission box, then it cuts you off at 300, and you're trying to pare back from there. Sometimes, depending on the conference, they will request additional things from you. You will know if you need these things, so you don't need to include them unless they tell you you need to include them. Sometimes, like Tolkien Society events, request a biography of your biography before you submit your proposal. So sometimes you'll need to include that. And then some will require or request or suggest a working bibliography, which is really just to ensure that this is research that's underway and that I guess people aren't just winging random stuff out into the ether. But again, those are the exception rather than the norm. But just checking through guidelines and making sure that you have those things if they want them. Of course, first step is giving your paper a title, which I think in my years of being a fandom archivist is possibly one of the most challenging things people are asked to do. With conference papers, seriously, just keep it to the essential. If the titles are something that stress you out, they stress a lot of people out, just keep it to the essentials. Like, just state your topic as a title. That's fine. Nobody's handing out Pulitzer Prizes for, Tolkien studies titles. There are people who write snazzy titles. That's totally fine. If that's a skill that you have, go for it. Have fun with it, but it's not a requirement. Again, just as long as the topic is clear, then you're good. And then finally, don't forget to include your name, including your contact information, which is your email. Nobody wants to do phone calls these days, which is fine by me, but just make sure your name and your email are on there in case your proposal gets printed out and separated from your original email. Then it's not something that, the organizer is not trying to sift back to try to find who sent it, that it's very easy to tell who you are. So once you have those things set up on your paper, then you are good to go and ready to start writing your proposal. Okay, so paragraph 1, which recall is the introduction, is going to have 3 main sections. So first of all is your hook to get your reader's attention. I will admit that I leave this off sometimes. I get lazy and I don't put this in. But especially when you're just getting started and you're not necessarily a known name yet, then, when somebody's reading through a lot of different things, getting their attention is always a good thing. The middle of your introduction is any essential background information that you need to share, and then you end by stating the tension, conflict, or problem that you intend to solve. Okay, so hooks, the part that I hate to write. So the easiest way for a hook is to start with a quote. Um, go through Tolkien's letters, do a keyword search if you have a digital version of it, find a cool quote, find a quote from the books, find a quote about Tolkien. That's a pretty easy approach. If you want to get a little more snazzy with it, then you can do some sort of brief narrative where you're like telling a little story. An example of that what might be if I'm say doing a proposal for the upcoming UVM Tolkien and War, then my little narrative might be J.R.R. Tolkien was only 24 years old when he joined the war that would become the deadliest in British history. So I'm just telling like a tiny little story to orient my reader to the topic. And then the one that I've used in my example, if you're like, why is she reading right to left like she's reading Arabic? It's because the one that I've used in the example that follows is to start with a surprising fact or statistic. That's another pretty easy way to do a hook. There's obviously like many, 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 many other ways to do hooks. Like I have a handout that I give my students when I make them write essays, which they absolutely love. I say sarcastically, that has 9 different ways to start an essay. Your next section is background information. These are the things that this is the information that the person reading your proposal needs to know to understand the argument that you're making. And again, you're working within a few words, so you're not going to be able to tell them absolutely everything. So you really this is where you need to distill down to like the most important things that they need to know. Because I know I could probably write 2 pages of background information on the topics that I present about. Looking more for 2 sentences, maybe 3 or 4, depending on how long your sentences are. And you can also keep in mind your audience is Tolkien fans as well. So they're going to have familiarity with, you don't need to be like J.R.R. Tolkien was a really famous author in the 20th century. Like everyone's going to know that. They're going to be familiar with the main books and passingly familiar probably with the subsidiary text as well. So you can skip a lot of the basics that if you were not talking to an audience of Tolkien fans. And then finally, a single sentence of what's the problem that you intend to solve, which you can think of as a gap or conflict in our understanding of Tolkien. So what are you filling in here? What are you contributing to the field of Tolkien studies here? Like what direction are you going in? That's your last sentence, and that wraps up your introduction. So taking a look at those in action. So first of all, the hook. So remember I used my surprising factor statistic. So this is a proposal that I wrote for Tolkien at UVM last year for a paper that was titled Grief, Grieving, and the Quenta Silmarillion. So again, notice the title, not snazzy, super basic and to the point. And this is the proposal for that paper that I presented last year. So the hook, throughout his letters, Tolkien describes the most important theme of his work not as humility, heroism, or even power, but death. That fact surprised me when I first started doing this research. So I was like, that's probably a solid hook to use. That's something that probably a lot of people have never really realized, how frequently in his letters he mentions the fact that a key theme in his work, in some cases he says the most important theme in his work, is not those other things that we tend to think about, but actually death. And since I was writing about death, then, the hook emphasizes the importance of that. My background information in just 2 sentences, although they're long sentences. But notice how I'm not giving like super basic background information. It's the key facts that need to be known before understanding the argument that I'm making, which is the main narrative found in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion, the Quenta Silmarillion, contains 90 deaths of named characters, as well as countless deaths of characters who remain unnamed. Considering that grief is a universal human emotion and mourning rituals a universal throughout cultures around the world, one would expect the Quenta Silmarillion to be filled with grief and mourning, but it is not. And now I've set up for the problem that I intend to solve, which is that in looking for looking for those death scenes, I noticed that while some characters are grieved and mourned, not all are. Likewise, not all characters are permitted to mourn loved ones who die. So when I noticed that in my research, this was something where I was like, I want to figure out why this is. And that is the problem, the gap that I intended to solve. So now I've done my intro. I've set up for my second paragraph, which is the what and the how. So again, it has three main sections. Your main idea starts it off, which secondary writing teachers like me like to call your thesis statement. This is simply a sentence stating what you are arguing. That's it. So thesis statement is one of those words that's like makes it sound way more challenging than it actually is. It's just the point that you're making, your claim, your argument. Methodology is in the middle. And again, that's a big, scary academic sounding word that simply means how will you collect evidence to support your thesis? If you think about you're writing a piece of metal on Tumblr, and you're writing about elven women in the Silmarillion, how are you collecting the information about that? Are you looking at every scene in the Silmarillion that involves a woman? Are you looking at, like I just did, where you're looking at their dialogue and you're actually counting the words that they speak compared to the men? Are you looking at what Tolkien wrote in his letters about elven women? Those are all three very different methodologies, but that's how you're getting your information. And then finally, your results are, of course, what you have learned. So your thesis statement, like I said, is your main idea. It's brief and to the point. So it's just a single sentence as a general rule. But, this isn't high school. So if you want to write it as two sentences, go wild. Methodology, like I said, is simply the how you will prove your thesis. So some things to think about there. What texts are you going to use, right? I mean, Tolkien, we have literally dozens of Tolkien books. Are you writing about Lord of the Rings? Are you writing about the Silmarillion? If you're writing about the Silmarillion, are you considering drafts in History of Middle-earth? Those are the kinds of things you want to mention in your methodology. So if I was to talk about death and grieving, for example, if I were to tell you that is my topic, that's going to look really different if I'm writing about it from Lord of the Rings than it is if I write about it about the Silmarillion. So I want to be clear which book I'm pulling from as talking about death and grieving. If you're building on any existing research or ideas, then this is where you want to mention that. If you're taking any theoretical approaches, if you're looking at I hate to even say it because my degree is in psychology, like Freudian analysis, but that's the first one that pops to mind. That's where you want to mention that. Other interdisciplinary approaches. So if you're bringing in scientific fields, psychology, social sciences, quantitative work, then all of that goes in there. And then any other methods, some of which that I just thought of off the top of my head when I made this would be text analytics. So counting words, which is something I do a lot. Biographical study. So looking at Tolkien's life and how that impacted his work. Surveys. Primary sources such as critic and fan responses. So actually going back to those old newspaper clippings of reviews of Lord of the Rings, for example, or pulling up, early 2000s discussion forums for how fans reacted to the films versus the books. Those are all things that would be approaches that would go in methodology. And then finally, your second what is what you learn from your research, which is your results. What conclusions can you draw? And here you want to write as though your research is complete. Pro tip, most of the time it's not going to be. I have totally done the stereotypical thing of writing the paper in the car on the way to the conference. I was not driving, just to be clear. My husband was driving. And we were going to UVM and I had my laptop on my knees and I was typing up the final bits of the paper as we were driving to Burlington. So if your work is not done when you send in the proposal, you are probably no one else's is either. If they are superhuman, and congratulations if that's you, but it sure ain't me. And then if you can tie this back to your methodology. So how you draw your conclusions based on the evidence that you've collected. And then you also want to start thinking about why is this research new, unique, or interesting, right? Because we can all regurgitate other people's ideas. But what makes fan research in a lot of cases so fascinating and unique is that we are putting out ideas that are not in the scholarship yet. And I say yet because we haven't put them there yet. So if you're taking stuff in a new direction, this is where you mention it. If you're building on something that is existing and in a new important way, this is where you would mention that. Okay, so paragraph 2 of my Grief Grieving in the Quenta Silmarillion, or Grief Grieving and Permission to Mourn in the Quenta Silmarillion is the title. So my thesis, again, single sentence. In this presentation, I will demonstrate that grief and mourning are politicized by Pengaloth, the narrator of the Quenta Silmarillion, to humanize some characters while dehumanizing others. This is the claim that I'm proving, my thesis statement. Single sentence, pretty straightforward. Methodologies in the middle. How am I going to do this? By building on the research that draws on historical analogs between grief and mourning in Tolkien's works and medieval literary sources. I will show that death scenes in the Quenta Silmarillion use Western medieval tropes around death, grief, and mourning to signify good and bad deaths. Okay, so I'm building on some existing research here, part of my methodology. Next, using text analytics, I will show that characters permitted to grieve or to receive grief and mourning are aligned with the narrative biases expected of Pengaloth. So I'm going into the text. I'm looking at specific passages around grief, around death, grief, and mourning, and I'm analyzing those specific small passages in depth. There's my methodology. And then finally, my results. So the what I learned from this and why this extends what we know about Tolkien in new directions. The narrator uses grief and mourning in 2 ways. To show a deceased character is worthy of grief, sometimes detracting from their morally questionable actions, and to humanize characters who engage in grief. Characters such as Feanor and Maeglin, who would be disfavored by the narrator, do not receive grief, centering their damaging choices, and often do not show grief, suggesting that they are not capable of this most human of emotions. This research extends the study of death and grieving from the Lord of the Rings and into the Silmarillion, and adds additional clarity to the question of narrative perspective and bias, which has received little and conflicting attention in the scholarship so far. Okay, and my sample proposal is in the document on the SWG. So if you want to see like the whole thing together, then it will be available with the title too, and the whole setup, how I set up my conference proposals. So now your third paragraph, which is usually a smaller one, just like the first one. And this is where you get into your so what. So conclusion and so what. And this only has 2 main sections. So your key takeaways, you're restating your thesis and your big ideas. And then why does this matter? Which is sometimes the hardest part to write. Just because, especially knowing a lot of fans over the years, which I do, we tend to, oh, well, this isn't that, this is just me nerding around. I mean, I catch myself saying it all the time. This is just me, like, just noodling around, being a nerd. It's not important. But actually, it is. A lot of what we're doing is not being done. And a lot of what we're doing is taking research into new directions. So embrace it, be confident and proud of your work, and state why it is important, why it matters. So your key takeaways are just briefly summarizing your results or conclusions. But if there's a conference theme, then this is where you're going to connect to it. You're going to talk about why this connects to the theme. And then your so what, the hard part to write, at least for me, everybody's different, but it's often the hardest part for me, is to directly address why your results and conclusions matter. You just want to be really direct and blunt here. Some ways to think about this, because it can be hard to think like, okay, why does this thing that I've done as a hobby matter? It's a hobby, it's fun. Who cares? I actually tell my students when they write their conclusions, I say, answer that question, who cares? So are you providing new evidence, ideas, or perspectives? That's obviously why it matters if you are. Are you building or extending existing work? If you think back to my proposal, that final sentence in my middle paragraph, I talked about extending. There has been a lot of work on death and grief in The Lord of the Rings, but very little on the Silmarillion. So I'm extending into new text, existing work that is being done. And then how does this impact how we understand Tolkien's work? And this is a big one, especially in fandom, where a lot of times we're doing things related to gender, queer studies, race studies, and so on. This is new territory for a lot of Tolkien scholarship. And so people are reading Tolkien in new ways right now in the scholarly community that we as fans have been reading Tolkien for a while now. So definitely think about that. If that is your area of work, then you almost certainly have your answer to this question right there. In the fact that you're just working in that particular domain, which is very new, controversial in some circles right now, but gaining a lot of traction as far as there's been entire like the Tolkien and Diversity seminar held by the Tolkien Society, entire conferences centered around this. Okay, so my conclusion. So my key takeaways, kind of summing up my results one more time. In all, analysis of grief and grieving in the Quenta Silmarillion shows that Tolkien engaged in a careful pseudo-historical construction of this text, where in-universe historicity is generated in part by how the narrator responds to various characters' deaths across a complex political and historical landscape. When the narrator sympathizes with a character, that character's value is shown through the reaction of others to his or her death. When a character earns the narrator's disapprobation, she or he is partly dehumanized through a lack of acknowledgement of any grief or mourning. And then, why does this matter? The who cares, as I tell my students. The narrator of the published Silmarillion is very hard to discern and is typically not considered by scholars. But this research shows that not only was he present and shaped Tolkien's creative choices, but his perspectives and biases should always be in mind when analyzing the meaning of the Quenta Silmarillion. So I'm proposing a shift in a lot of ways in how we read the Silmarillion with this presentation, and saying this idea of the narrator that a lot of us don't tend to think about when we're reading this text that feels very omniscient. We do actually need to think about that. And if we do think about it, here's what we can notice. Here's extra layers of the text that otherwise would probably go unseen if we're not looking at it through this particular lens. That's why the work is important. Okay, so some final thoughts about writing proposals for Tolkien studies specifically, or the humanities more broadly. So use active voice. So this is especially, and I know that like STEM fields are getting away from this, but I mean, I started in STEM way back. I was an undergrad, and I know that like, you're often the the samples were measured. It's like, no, you can, and this gets into the next one, which is the first person pronouns are okay. When I was taught to write formal writing, I was told do not use first person ever. Like it was, you got in trouble in my school if you wrote with first person. So if you were likewise taught in the same way that I am, it can be really hard to get rid of that. I still feel this little like itch in the back of my brain when I write a first person pronoun, like I'm doing something wrong, but it is okay. So this is your direct, clear language, my third little sticky note up here. So you can absolutely be as direct as say, I will, I show, my research shows. You want to be really direct and clear, not like kind of roaming around the point, because again, you have few words to work with. So don't waste them avoiding writing in first person and trying to be kind of convoluted in that. And then finally, write like your research is done, even if it's not. So nothing like, I think this research is going to show, or I intend that this research might show. You want to write like your research is done. You should have enough of an idea of what your conclusions are, obviously, if you're making a proposal, but you're probably still gathering evidence, still shoring up some of those ideas. And I also want to say here that it is okay if some of what you end up doing in your proposal, you end up shifting as you work. If I look back at my proposals and I look at the papers that I actually ended up writing, sometimes directions I thought were going to be a really heavy part of the paper ended up not being so much, because I discovered that other areas that I was looking at were more interesting. So I spent more time on those. So you don't have to feel like a proposal is like it is not a marriage proposal. You are not married to 100% of these ideas, but like you should write like you're done. Um, and you shouldn't deviate too far from it, obviously. Please don't submit a proposal for death, grief, and permission to mourn in the Quenta Silmarillion and then write about the symbolism of Hobbit food in Lord of the Rings. That would be a bridge too far. But just know that it's understood proposals are coming in months before the actual conference. It's understood that your ideas are going to evolve. So please don't feel super locked in to what you are saying here as far as your conclusions. They are allowed to shift. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for being here today. The QR code on the screen will take you to the handouts, the slideshow, and the video right on the SWG. So everything's there in one place for you to refer to. This is the first of what I believe will be three sessions in a series. So you want to present at a Tolkien conference. So if you enjoyed the session today and would like to attend future ones, or if you would just like to keep up with us, more information on Merith Adairthad, etc., then we have a few ways to reach out. We have our newsletter, which the direct URL is right there on the screen. But if you go to our website, silmarillion.writersguild.org, in the left-hand sidebar, then there's a subscription block at the bottom there, or click on the news link at the top and you can subscribe through there. The newsletter is weekly and it is generally the most up-to-date information that we send out. We have a Tumblr where we post news and announcements. So if you're on Tumblr, please follow us there. And for my old school people out there, my fellow fandom olds, we are also on Dreamwith at Soul Writers Guild. So those are all the places that if you want to see more about upcoming sessions and Merith Adairthad, please follow us on one or several of those places. And a special thank you finally. This was a collaborative effort with Janeways, Admiral Monster, and Himring, who were not able to attend today, but all contributed to the discussion and creation of this presentation today. So thank you all for your help. And I hope to see you all at our next session.